Okay, thank you all for coming. I thought we'll get started right away. I'll have a brief introduction because my colleague here needs no introduction, actually. Mark Fitzpatrick, he is director of the IISS Non-Proliferation Disarmament Program. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation, distinguished career in the Foreign Service for a number of years before we were able to get him over to the IISS, and we're very pleased about that. His latest work is North Korean Security Challenges, a Net Assessment. This is our most recent IISS strategic dossier. For those of you who are interested in purchasing it, I think some of you already have it. I have copies. We still have some available here.
We have many, but today they're complimentary.
They're complimentary. Well, thank you, Mark.
That's a free lunch.
And the lunch, yeah, you can't do any better. I mean, this is great.
So you only have to ask softball questions.
That's right. But Mark, thank you for this. Congratulations on the net assessment, another important contribution to our understanding of North Korea and disarmament issues writ large. The floor is yours. We are on the record today, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Well, thank you for all for coming. You get a free dossier. We didn't give them away free in London because we had a funding issue, but we had already announced we're giving away free, so rather than change the goalposts, we followed through with our promise. You all may have seen, some of you may even have read, a 4-page launch statement which serves as an executive summary of the dossier and was the basis for a presentation we did in London on Thursday. To whittle down 4 pages of the executive summary into 1 page as a press release, you also may have seen this, and this highlights some of the key findings in the dossier. Then I was asked in my first interview with the press last week if I could just please whittle this down to 2 points. 216 pages down to 2 points, it gets more and more challenging. I'm not going to do Twitter. I don't mind if anybody Twitters while we're speaking here. But those 2 points, to summarize our findings, are number 1, that North Korea presents a range of security challenges to its neighbors and to the wider world. And this range of security challenges often can be exaggerated, and at the IISS we try to look in detail and provide a factual basis to our assessments. And I'll talk a little bit about that range of security challenges. And it's not just the military challenges, it's the human security aspects as well. And the second point is that these security challenges exacerbate an already dangerous situation that could prevail in the eventuality of a North Korean collapse of the state, which is greater today than it has been in the past because of 4 interlinked crises that the North Korean regime faces. So to go back to point number 1, the range of security challenges. The most frequently talked about is the range of challenges pertaining to weapons that can have mass destructive power. North Korea's nuclear weapons program, which is based on plutonium, now supplemented by uranium enrichment. The plutonium program has provided North Korea with enough for a handful of nuclear weapons. How many is impossible to assess with any degree of accuracy. We provide a pretty wide range, anywhere from, 6 to 14, but probably more likely less than 10 weapons could be produced with the plutonium available to North Korea. And North Korea now having apparently moved away from the plutonium production program to one based on uranium enrichment, because uranium enrichment is much easier to hide, is the most likely reason. And we're not confident that North Korea has given up on plutonium. It has not restored the facilities that it dismantled in summer of 2009, but could restore them in about 6 months. And who knows if it might not have something going on in a clandestine area. Chemical weapons, the world's 3rd largest arsenal. Not all of them have a long shelf life, but there's no evidence that North Korea has given up on chemical weapons. Biological weapons, we don't have great confidence that North Korea has a continuing offensive biological weapons program. We're agnostic about this. This is one of the ways that this year's dossier differs from the one in 2004 that IISS put out under my predecessor. Back then, there seemed to be more evidence of biological weapons, and certainly North Korea has a history of having engaged in a biological weapons program, but we're not sure if they still have it. And then the missiles. One of the ways in which we differ from the prevailing wisdom on North Korea's missile program is that we assess that North Korea's missile capabilities are almost all based on what they got from the former Soviet Union, during particularly while it was the Soviet Union, and afterwards there was some degree of unauthorized sales. Soviet Union had produced thousands of missiles, and many hundreds of them found their way to South Korea and formed the basis of South Korea's program. But what South Korea had been exporting, North Korea, so thank you for the correction. Do that whenever I mistake, please. North Korea, what it had been exporting was identical to what it had gotten from Russia. And it's not that a country can just make exactly the replica. Kind of the reverse engineering doesn't work with that degree of perfection. So we think that it's possible that North Korea's ability to export more missiles or to produce more missiles in great numbers might be attenuated. This doesn't mean that they couldn't produce longer range missiles. They can put together the engines that they have on hand and the missile bodies and go further. But if they do that, it will take at least 5 years of testing, which will be will be observable to the world. North Korea's military challenges, of course, include a wide range of conventional weapons, and it's not just the quantity of those weapons, it's North Korea's willingness to use them, to fire first, as we saw last year. Now, we differ in some ways with some of the assessments about North Korea's conventional weapons capabilities, in that, for example, its special forces. North Korea, we agree, has the world's largest special forces. But how many? The South Korean Ministry of Defense says 200,000. We just don't think 200,000 can be really special. They've all gotten some special training, and so in some ways you can say they're available for behind-the-lines work, for guerrilla mountain warfare, but they're not really special forces in the way the United States or the United Kingdom would identify them. We still think there's 80,000. That's a sizable number. Artillery, the number of artillery field guns and so forth that North Korea is able to direct against the South. It's on the order of 11,000. How many of them can reach downtown Seoul and turn it into what North Korea claims will be a sea of fire? Well, 300 of that range, the longer range. And so Seoul is not going to be turned into a sea of fire during a contingency, a war breaking out. But after about 10 minutes, a lot of those 300 pieces are going to be pulled back into defensive positions, or they're going to be taken out by counter-battery fire. And we believe that the United States and South Korea have probably done a lot of work to identify positions after the Yongbyon Island shelling last year, and have increased their capabilities of retaliation. But anyway, 300 pieces can still inflict a lot of destruction and a lot of confusion. There'll be refugees flows and so forth that will stymie South Korean military responses. There are, in addition, North Korea's military capabilities, or quasi-military, include things like the computer warfare that North Korea has been engaged in against various South Korean entities over the past year. Denial of service attacks against South Korean institutions, banks, and so forth. It seems an ongoing probing, and North Korea, to my initial expectations, has a much stronger, more engaged computer warfare capability than you might expect in a country where people don't have access to internet except for an elite. And I used to think that I remember reading Bill Gates. Used to practice with computers in his garage, tinkering for years and years. and all that kind of experience gives you the ability to do what Bill Gates has done. North Korean youth don't have that, but the military is training them intensively. The threats in the human security area are something that we newly explored in this dossier. The 2004 dossier focused on the military. We thought, North Korea's threat posture really has to include the human security, the human rights abuses, the forms of human security that cause refugee flows, that cause complications for North Korea's neighbors. It's one of the reasons China has changed its position vis-a-vis North Korea and decided to stick with the North Korean regime as is. All of that is part of the threat structure that North Korea presents. But the North Korea regime faces severe internal and external challenges. Politically, obviously, the succession is number one. Kim Jong-il had about 30 years to prepare for his takeover from his father. Kim Jong-un has had almost no time at all. He's inexperienced. He is not known to have any kind of his own political support structure. He relies entirely on his father's support. There's no evidence in the public realm of any internal disagreement with these succession plans. You'd think human nature would cause experienced generals to question why an untested youth who never served in the military would suddenly become a four-star general, and his aunt, who similarly had no military experience, again, a four-star general. You'd think thered be some internal questioning about that. It's not evident today. Whether this will erupt really depends on how long Kim Jong-il will survive. He's 70 years old. He's had a stroke. He looks healthier today than he looked in the year after that stroke, but he's almost certainly not going to survive until his 80th birthday. How long he survives will in large part determine how well this succession is able to function. What Kim Jong-il has done is place a greater emphasis on the state security apparatus. He and his son visited the State Security Department, one of their first visits after Kim Jong-un was brought into the public limelight. North Korea faces an ongoing economic crisis, what might be called the Great Leap Backwards. North Korea today, 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, is worse off as a country, and most of its people are worse off than they were back then. There have been, there was initially the famine. North Korea recovered to some extent, but in the last 5 years it's had at least 3 years of negative growth. So the economy is not going well, and they're not able to undertake the kind of structural reforms, openness, that would allow them to escape their poverty trap. North Korea faces a third crisis in terms of its external relations. North Korea's modus vivendi over the past couple decades has been to engage in provocations, to increase the tension, and then to try to get paid for decreasing it. And that mode of operation works only so long as your counterparts are willing to go along with it, and none of North Korea's interlocutors are willing to go along with it anymore. They're not going to buy that horse twice, in Secretary Gates' famous words. But will North Korea realize that the game has changed, or will they continue the old pattern of further provocations? The brinksmanship that they've been engaging to date, I think, will continue. But South Korea's response next time is going to be firm. And then how it escalates from there could be a very dicey situation. The fourth crisis North Korea faces is one of what you might call an existential crisis, sense of identity. North Korea has always prided itself on being the soul of the Korean people. They knew that the South Korean economy was far better but they portrayed themselves as the true inheritors of the Korean spirit, of the Korean sense of nationalism, of the ones who threw off the Japanese yoke all by themselves. You know, the Soviet role in this picture was erased from North Korean history. That lie about North Korea's Juche independence has now been exposed, and most of its people must realize that they are dependent on another country. Juche is only a set of words. It has no meaning. North Korea is in hock to China, and increasingly so politically and economically. All of these crises, interrelated as they are, could then, I think, make unification more likely. And we explore in the final chapter of the dossier the different scenarios for unification, the kinds of tipping points. But we don't overlook the possibility of a continuation in some form of the status quo, of North Korea continuing to exist as a regime, but possibly not as it is, but more in hock to China than ever. That North Korea becoming a kind of satellite state of China is not something that one can rule out. About 2 years ago, as reported in WikiLeaks cables from South Korea, there was evidence that Chinese policymakers were having a policy debate about what to do with North Korea. Did it present more of an asset or a liability? And at least some Chinese academics and policymakers were leaning toward the proposition that they really ought to cast their lot with an eventuality of North Korea coming together with South Korea, siding with the South Koreans in this. But whatever policy debate there had really been going on in China has seemed to be settled in terms of the status quo. China, in the last year, has given diplomatic support to North Korea over its provocations. They've given increasing economic support in terms of investment and aid. They've given increasing political support in terms of the level of engagement with North Korea. They've decided to try to preserve the North Korea regime as is. And that might be the future for North Korea. It's not something the North Koreans would want. Nobody wants to be under the thrall of another country. And I'm not saying they're going to become a real vassal state, but a dependency, I think, is something that may be in the cards. And I'll leave it at that. I think I've talked long enough. I know there's a lot of people who know more about North Korea than I do here, and I'm eager to have a discussion.
Great, Mark. Thank you for all of that. The floor is open. If you get my attention, if you'd say your name and affiliation, I'll get a list going. And Mark, I want to take the first question, if I could. You said early on that North Korea got a lot of its technology, arms technology, from the Soviet Union early on. What do we see today in terms of technology transfers of weapons to the North Koreans? How are they getting their capability? And specifically, if you could talk about Russia, China, and Iran in that context. I was also interested in your point at the end about North Korea being drifting towards a potential Chinese dependency. I think that's an interesting subject. You don't have to respond to that now, but maybe we'll return to it, or some of our other friends and colleagues around the table might want to pick that up as well.
Yeah, the question about where does North Korea get the wherewithal for its massive arms and missiles and nuclear capabilities and so forth. You know, they got a lot of it, obviously, as I said, from the Soviet Union. That has dried up in terms of official support. And we are not aware of a great deal of open source reporting, actually hardly any open source reporting about any continuation from Russia. And the Russian experts, Russians who are experts, deny vociferously that there is anything. And I'm just not aware of too much now. But North Korea doesn't need a lot more. They're able to produce the conventional weapons that they have. They're able to produce chemical weapons. They are able to, they have a large missile arsenal. There are huge questions about the missile arsenal, though. The two new missiles that North Korea displayed in October, the Musudan and the the replica of the Iranian Ghadar-1, which we in our book call the Nodom 2010 variation, may just have been mock-ups. The Musadan may just have been a mock-up. The Nodom 2010, the Ghadar-1, since Iran has it, it's more likely to believe that it's actually a real missile, and that now the missile technology flow that used to be North Korea to Iran has been at least reversed. Maybe it's two-way, but maybe Iran is now further ahead of North Korea. On the nuclear side, one of the newspapers in the United Kingdom that reported on our dossier launch on Thursday got it exactly wrong. And I had said in the presentation that we saw no evidence of a North Korean nuclear cooperation to Iran. And the headline was, and I thought, you'd think that after the Murdoch scandal, the press would get a little bit more on their, a little bit better. I don't doubt that there is a reason to have such cooperation, and it seems logical that the two sides have something to share with one another, but there's no evidence that I see for it. In fact, the evidence seems to be to the contrary. North Korea displayed a second-generation centrifuges at Yongbyon to Sigheker that were based on maraging steel, and Iran has been working on centrifuges that are based on carbon fiber, and they're different centrifuge models. You'd think if there was cooperation that Iran would at least have been able to import the specifications of what North Korea's got, and maybe some of its maraging steel. So I'm not saying there's no cooperation, but we don't see it, and don't claim it.
Chris?
Oh, thanks. Chris Nelson, also for great to see you, Mark.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm not going to ask a technical question because with Josh here and people like that, he can answer them for us. Increasingly, people who know South Korean politics feel that we should be paying more attention to the emerging debate as the presidential election comes up at the end of next year, but the parliamentary election much sooner. And it isn't just whether a re-emerged Korean Democratic Party is going to make trouble for chorus, but the criticisms of the Lee hardline policy have been getting more and more firm. And so I question, not in the challenging sense, but explain to us why you feel you can state with such confidence that the hardline Lee policy will continue, versus the suggestion that maybe in response to domestic pressure and the kinds of theater that we've just seen over the weekend, all buddies checking boxes. Do you think the South Korean hardline policy, so-called, is going to be able to continue because of South Korean domestic politics?
Thanks, Chris. We don't say that the hardline policy generally in terms of positions regarding talking with the North Koreans will continue. What we say is that the Im Young-bak government, and in fact almost any government in South Korea, has to respond with firmness the next time that North Korea conducts a provocation like it did last year. That the tremendous backlash in South Korea to what was perceived as a weakness on South Korea's part means that there will be a firmer response next time. And I'm not aware how the debate ongoing in South Korea today in terms of diplomacy with North Korea changes that military posture. Now, one might think, okay, even though the rules of engagement have been changed in terms of giving the frontline commanders the authority to fire back when fired upon, maybe they still will feel compelled to call back for instructions. But I think that it's most likely that South Korea will be responding, at least in kind, if not a little bit more the next time.
Jack?
Jack Pritchard. Mark, thanks very much for this. You touched on it briefly, but when Kim Jong-il passes, if and when there's a challenge to Kim Jong-un, how serious, where do you think it'll come from, and it will be limited to the military?
Jack, that's a question that we tried to explore and boy, it's really hard to get anything because of, as you know, the black hole nature of North Korea. We tried to look at the various military commands in the North and do an assessment of which ones were most likely to be firmly supportive of the family in whatever circumstances, and whether there might be any kind of a possibility for a Libya-type geographic division within the military. We didn't get too far into that, but we did note sort of some of the commands most central to both Kim and then Pyongyang being probably the commands that would stay loyal to him. But it's hard to go further. The best we could do is just to say that we think that it's more likely today than it has been in the past that at some point North Korea may face either internally or from without somebody pushing back, and this could be one of the tipping points.
Jonathan Pollock, also the author of important work on North Korea in our Delphi series.
Thank you, Andrew.
Congratulations on that. Thank you.
Yes, Jonathan Pollock from Brookings. Mark, I'm wondering if I might push you on a couple of things a bit more, because if I understood your comments, you're saying, well, the odds are higher now for something that would look like the end of the regime as we know it, even as you indicated that China's leadership seems to have made a commitment to, as you said, preserve North Korea as is. Now, without ruling out the possibility for some kind of an internal evolution, and maybe any kind of an internal evolution is going to be inherently disruptive, it seems to me that from what we can judge, the regime may be viable for a lot longer than many would give it credit for. A caution flag here, obviously. As you know, we have gone through repeated cycles of so-called collapsist thinking. By my count, there have been 4 since 1990. They ebb and flow, and the regime persists. So it would seem to me that the China factor here looms very, very significant. One other comment, and it's important. Juche, as I understand it, is not self-reliance. The North Koreans don't claim it is. Juche is self-determination. That's a real important distinction. North Koreans are sometimes will admit to what they are able to beg, borrow, and steal from the outside world, but it's what you choose to do with it and the degree to which your own conduct is answerable by, in terms of the preference of others. That's where the true bloody mindedness prevails. So I think it's important to keep those distinctions in mind. One last thing. I think that the more that we have begun to understand about the difficulties of keeping out particular kinds of technologies, and if I could single out computer technologies to be very, very precise, that there is a dedicated effort within the North. Some recent visitors to the North have seen a pretty impressive array of equipment. So it's not that you have to have a systemic wired society, but if you have enough dedicated efforts in various places, then we ought not to sell that short. So your thoughts?
Yeah, we are very conscious of the predictions that have been made over the years about an imminent North Korean collapse, and so we don't claim that it is going to happen. We just say that it is more likely now than it has been for some years, and leave it at that. But we point to the potential tipping points and as I say, the reasons why it faces a greater set of crises now and in the years shortly ahead. But the China factor is why, after going through the various unification scenarios, the last thing we ended with was this prospect that, yeah, maybe it will just continue, but more under China's thrall. And it's not something that I think will endear us to a lot of our friends in South Korea. But in some ways, you might think that if you're a South Korean and thinking about the huge economic costs and political costs of unification, having somebody else bear the brunt of taking care of your poor cousins in the North for some period of time might be actually better. The Juche definition of self-determination. I read your book, of course, and then I had a debate with some of my contributors to the dossier, and I should stress that unlike in some previous dossiers, I was not the main author. We get anonymous contributors who unfortunately have to remain anonymous. And we had a big debate about this, and I lost the debate when I tried to translate Juche as self-determination, and they, because they know more about North Korea than I did, they still insisted that self-reliance is the better translation. Technology, it's a good point. I remember when I was in the State Department and the controls, back 10, 15 years ago on what could be exported. Boy, computers have gone well beyond that today, so I think we may have lost that battle.
Paul Stairs.
Paul Stairs, Council on Foreign Relations. I have a technical question, but one with political ramifications. And the answer may be in the dossier, which I'm looking forward to read, but could you give us your assessment of the state of nuclear warhead design and development, particularly for long-range missile delivery?
Thank you, Paul. That's another question that we thought about a lot in preparing this. We cannot state with confidence that North Korea today is able to produce a nuclear warhead that is deliverable. But if they can't, they soon will be able to. Now, the factors are not just size of the warhead and can it fit in the missiles, the Nodong, particularly the Nodong 2010 variant, but also the re-entry of complications, the heat, the friction, the turbulence of atmospheric re-entry, all of which increases the difficulty the longer the missile has to fly. We think that for North Korea's Nodongs, probably North Korea has done enough testing and experiments, cold testing and the like, that that's not a huge problem for them, but it would be a bigger problem for a Taepodong missile. There's more detail in the dossier about this, but part of it, well, there are variables that we just don't know. Did North Korea get a tested nuclear weapons design from the Con network? It's very possible that they did, since the Con network was, had a couple different designs and had sold one to a rather cheap price to Libya. Why wouldn't they sell it to any other customer? So I think intelligence analysts have to err on the side of worst case and assume that North Korea got what the Con network was willing to sell. Of course, that was based on a highly enriched uranium, but much of it would have been applicable to North Korea's plutonium program. One of the reasons North Korea is apparently switching its emphasis to highly enriched uranium may be because of its, if it got warhead designs, maybe they think that it's more likely that they'll work without needing to test them. There's still a number of unknowns.
Yes.
Gordon Flake with the Mansfield Foundation. First, I wanted to thank you, or praise you for kind of including a chapter on unification. Often, inter-Korean relations is kind of a stepchild, and we think of North Korea as in a vacuum. But the question I have is kind of related to that. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about how you see South Korea factoring in some of the other chapters you've got. Because again, the nuclear issue may be a little bit apart, but a lot of the other security issues, chemical, biological, the broader questions of diplomacy, et cetera, South Korea plays a very different role, and I'm kind of curious as to, in the dossier area as a whole, whether you saw South Korea as an independent actor, a completely independent actor, whether it's kind of a key variable in your preparation of the report as a whole.
Thank you, Gordon. In one chapter, we precisely do compare North and South Korea conventional capabilities. We do a kind of a military balance of the two sides and assess that South Korea's military capabilities have been steadily improving. North Korea's have been deteriorating in terms of their quality, although they've introduced some newer capabilities that South Korea doesn't have, things like the midget submarines. South Korea obviously has a much stronger military than the North does, and in any military scenario, and we tried to look at a couple different scenarios, South Korea is going to prevail, but there will be that period of time before it's all over where there will be a lot of destruction, and that's why the possibility of a South Korean-led invasion of the North is just not in the cards at all. But in the unification chapter, we do note that in a scenario of North Korean collapse, this question about what happens with North Korea's nuclear assets will be very much on the minds of South Korean policymakers and American. And there may be I assume there will be a desire to do something about that. If, though, that desire becomes a situation where there's an intervention in North Korea to try to seize control of North Korean nuclear assets, if that is done in a way that is not consulted with China in advance or in real time, there's a possibility that China might perceive that as a hostile act, the way it did in the Korean War, and we spell out that this is one of the dangers here. So we do look at the South Korean dynamics in terms of military, but you can't ignore the United States' role when you're looking at the military posture, and so we throw in what assets the United States has to bring to bear, and then in the political unification discussion, well, South Korea is an independent actor and does factor in.
Ed Levine.
Edward Levine, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but speaking strictly for myself and not as an expert on the territory. I wonder whether your scenario of increasing dependency on the Chinese might be something that the Chinese would perceive as solving the problem for the United States and South Korea by taking away the option of getting plenty of goodies in return for provocations.
I should make, I should have had a disclaimer that even though I used to work for the U.S. government, nothing in this dossier should at all be interpreted as a policy has any influence, has been influenced by any insider information, because I doubt that anybody in Washington policymaking circles would come to that conclusion, or in Seoul. But it is kind of an interesting thought experiment that we do play around with a bit in the dossier about whether this, in fact, is one way of addressing the problem. The difficulty is that China doesn't seem to have any influence over North Korea's military posture. They didn't stop it from testing the second time, even though they got furious at the first time. They couldn't stop the provocations. And the Chinese say that they're working the issue from all angles. At the Shangri-La dialogue in early June, the Minister of Defense of China assured all of us, as Chris heard, that at every level they were trying to influence the North Koreans to cool it. We're not real confident that North Korea is going to cool it. Maybe China will have more influence in affecting North Korea's economic decisions if they're under more of a tutelage. Now, they've been trying that too, and North Korea hasn't responded. And they tried a couple of times, but they walked back those reforms that they implemented. But even if North Korea does implement more economic liberalization, openness, and so forth, it doesn't mean that they're going to change their military posture, that they would be more willing to give up their nuclear arms. Those decisions may be on a different track. So I'm not confident that Chinese dependency will solve our problems with North Korea.
I didn't mean solve in the sense of getting rid of the nuclear weapons. I meant more solve in the sense of changing North Korea's calculus for what it has to do to survive as a state, and make it less inclined to go South Korea and the United States because that isn't where it's going to get anything anyway.
It would be nice if the North would learn that from the Chinese, that they're not going to prevail. We'll have to see. In the meantime, there's one part of me that says, China, you created this problem, or you had a strong impact. Solve it.
Josh Pollock.
Josh Pollock, SAIC. Mark, bearing in mind what you just said about your lack of control over your anonymous authors, I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about why you reached the conclusion that North Korea's stock of missiles was supplied by the Soviets and not made in North Korea. In my own research, I found that they've exported about 500 missiles over the years, have exported entire missile production lines, and have exhibited a number of types that never existed in the Soviet Union. So I'm a little puzzled by that.
Josh, thanks. I know you've done work on this, and I wish that you had published your own latest paper before we finalized our chapters. Maybe we should have to look a little bit more detail into what systems the North has exported that the Soviet Union never had. Which ones come to mind to you?
Well, the Scud-D, the Nodong, the Musudan.
Okay, North Korea hasn't exported the Musudan. Iran got some engines of the Musudan and maybe a kit of the Musudan.
The kit is the missile, it's not fully assembled.
It whether it was strictly from South Korea or North Korea or from the Soviet Union via North Korea, there's some murkiness there, and I don't think the story is clear. The Scud-D, so some independent work on taking a missile they had and doing some work on it. But the basic system was something that originally came from the Soviet Union, the Scud systems. I'm not denigrating North Korea's ability to produce missiles, but we conclude that they have not developed a capability to produce and develop new missile systems on their own. It's they're based on basically what they got, and then using parts of it or making some modifications. And well, it's not that I didn't have control over my authors. It's that some of my authors know more than I do. And the IISS way of producing these kind of dossiers is to subject each of our chapters to an intensive peer review. I'm sorry I didn't ask you to join this process, but we try to get experts who have different origins in terms of nationality and expertise to try to iron out any biases that may creep in.
Mark, should the U.S. be talking to North Korea in the 6+2 or directly?
Oh, I think the United States should be talking to North Korea. I think diplomacy certainly should be explored in various manifestations. I don't think it's going to solve the problem. I don't see any willingness on North Korea's part today to barter away its nuclear arsenal for economic or diplomatic or political benefits the way I used to think might be possible. But that doesn't mean one shouldn't talk with them, because at least while talks are going on, there's not shooting. Now, the difficulty there, the conundrum, is that that sort of gives North Korea a blackmail capability. Talk or we'll shoot. But the potential for war in the Korean Peninsula is so real that one has to explore avenues for diplomacy. And six-party talks, of course, are only one potential form of diplomacy. The best is South-North talks with the United States playing an accompanying role. I don't think it should be United States and North Korea, leaving out the South Koreans, who after all are on the peninsula. But I'm happy that Kim Gae-gwan is coming to New York, and that there will be some sort of talks, and that the South and North talked at the ASEAN meeting. So, I don't think one should get too excited that there's a resolution at hand, but talking is better than not talking.
Andy, could we amend that question slightly?
Go ahead, please.
Mark, one of the standard criticisms, and I made it myself probably 7,000 times when I write about it, is yeah, but if we're not talking about what we're worried about, which is the continued development of the warhead, continued development of the ICBM, at some point they will do it, you say, isn't that in itself a mandatory talk situation of some kind? You know, you set aside the bigger picture, set aside the regime survival, set aside for a minute all those things that drive us all crazy with these guys. They're doing stuff that was against our core interests, and we're not really doing anything about it.
I would, as personally
Yeah.
support the thesis and the feelings behind it, and I think that even though North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear arsenal, there may be secondary objectives that are achievable. Export of systems, development of additional systems, testing of additional systems.
Right.
I mean, if North Korea continues to test nuclear weapons, it'll get closer to being able to have one that actually will work if they shoot it at somebody. So yes, there are, I think, some important objectives for talking. Now, how much one wants to give up to get those is another question.
It's the problem, isn't it?
That was an intervention down here.
Yeah, just one, yeah. Paul Kirk, Congressional Research Service. Mark, one thing, just a point of information, which, and this was news to me when I read it, but it may not be news to anyone else, but regarding the warhead design that was exported to the Libyans, according to Dr. Alberti's new book, it was incomplete, missing several vital components, which I guess is good. And if that is the same design that was digitized, and I think it was, then that may mean that there's not, in fact, there may be maybe one fewer tested design out there. And as I said, I mentioned that to one colleague, and it was news to him, and I mentioned it to another one, and it was not news to him. So I just don't remember.
You know, it's not news to me because, in fact, we mentioned that in our dossier, the very first one I did in 2007 on nuclear black markets. We characterized it as 95% complete. This is the design that the Libyans got. Now, the Libyans on their own would have had difficulty probably completing the last 5%. But I don't think the North Koreans would have as much difficulty. They've been working on this issue a lot longer. They've got a lot more qualified technicians and engineers. So I don't think that's a huge problem. And then the smaller designs that reportedly were on computer files of other parts of the CON network in Switzerland, I never got too much information about how complete they were. Do you know anything about that?
Off the top of my head, no, but I haven't dug back into David already. I need to reread David already.
Yeah, he doesn't say
So,
he doesn't say whether they're 100%. They kind of sound like there was a lot.
Josh
The
might know.
France and Collins book gets into this, and they're incomplete as well.
Thanks.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Mr. Yoneyama?
Hi, Yoneyama from same company, Japanese multinational. I'm just wondering how North Korea has cyber attack capability, offense or defense ability of cyber stuff.
Well, how they got it, I don't. I mean, they train intensively. They have recruited a core number of some of their brightest college graduates, put them into cyber attack units in the Army. They have been launching denial of service attacks for the last 2 years. Now, it's of course impossible to determine 100% that it came from North Korea, but the evidence of the IPS addresses and so forth in China all seems to point to North Korea being the source of it. And it's not that China doesn't do such things to its own, but North Korea has both the motive and the means to want to explore this in a future wartime scenario. I think they're practicing now.
A follow-up question actually on what he asked. Is North Korea today capable of attacking U.S. Infrastructure, U.S. cybersecurity infrastructure? And my second question is, you mentioned about the economic component, and I've seen some conflicting media reports suggesting that perhaps there's not enough money to go around to pay for the North Korean elites. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
The first question about can North Korea attack U.S. Computers. I think if North Korea can attack South Korean banks and government or institutions, it probably can do the same to the United States. We don't get into this in our dossier, but it just seems logical to me. I don't know if anybody else would disagree with that. The second question about does North Korea have the economic wherewithal to pursue this range of threatening capabilities? You wouldn't think so. They're impoverished to have less today than they had in 1989. But if a country is centrally led and command decision making, they can put the few resources they have into what matters most to them, and this matters most. They devote about 24% of their national budget for military, exclusive of the nuclear program. And that's the most important thing to them, because that's what they believe will keep the regime in place. We'll see.
All right, Mark, I want to congratulate you on a fantastic product. Again, this net assessment, well done, and thank you for a great presentation.
Well, thank you
today.
for very good questions.